Joining us on the Young Turks, Governor Howard Dean. Only the real fighters get that kind of intro.
There we go.
Governor, always good to have you on.
Thanks for having me on.
We appreciate it. Now, you've made a lot of headlines recently. You just called Fox News racist, which is awesome.
Well, I said what they did was racist.
Yes. So tell
some
us,
of them are racist and some of them aren't.
Right. So tell us why you think what they did in the Shirley Sherrod case is racist.
Because what they're doing is race baiting. Basically, they have had a narrative going on for quite some time. I think the most famous kickoff was Glenn Beck saying that Barack Obama hated white people. What they're doing is appealing to people's basest instincts, racial hatred. Racial hatred is something that's endemic in the country, but we've really gone way past it now. We've made huge progress, but there are still a fringe of people who have great fears about race, and what they're doing is feeding those fears. They say things that aren't true. They put together stories, as Fox did with the Shirley Sherrod thing, that isn't true. They have done the same thing in this nonsense about the Black Panther Party and Obama coddling black people and all this crap. And it's not true, and it's racist. If you're appealing to people's racial fears, then you're a racist.
Do you think that the whole theme that Beck and then Limbaugh, which is of course who's not part of Fox News but part of the
and he is a racist. There's no question about that. I mean, when George Steinbrenner died, he said something like, "Well, his major contribution is to have created a whole lot of African American millionaires." I mean, it's just this kind of stuff is just awful.
Do you think the theme that they're building, that they keep going back to, that this is a redistribution of wealth, that that's what Obama wants to do, that it's payback for slavery or all of the rest of it, etc. They talk about reparations. Is the code words there? Obama's here to take white people's money and give it to black people?
Sure it is. I mean, that's what they do, and it's stupid. It's bad for the country. It's what I call the Slobodan Milosevic approach to American politics. You divide people as much as possible. In the short term, it sometimes works people do get elected on this stuff, but it always ends up destroying the country.
But isn't there an element of this, Governor Dean, that has to do with the fact that people are resentful, that they feel screwed, and they don't know why, but they know that times are tough? And isn't it, Milosevic is an interesting comparison, but don't you think there's also a connection to Father Coughlin and
sure.
the 30s, and I want to tie it at some point to your piece today in the Huffington Post that nobody seems to be fighting for regular people. They're afraid, and this is a way of giving a name to their fear that it's minorities taking what you deserve away from you.
Right, but this is not anything different than George Wallace did when he was running for president. Nobody would pretend that George Wallace wasn't a racist when he was doing that, or Lester Maddox. I mean, this is just base politics, which is really terrible for the country. Look, I can put up with Fox being conservative about economics and all that stuff. We can have our differences of opinion. This is just fundamentally bad for the country. It's a group of people who put their own needs in front of the needs of the country.
I couldn't possibly agree with that more. I'm 100% in that camp. All right, so final question for you, Governor Dean. Fox News has responded to your charges. They put out a statement. Michael Clemente, senior VP of Fox News, says, "As we said this past week, some people, such as the failed candidate Dean, reflexively blame Fox for almost anything." How do you respond to that?
I just don't take Fox seriously. They're not a news outfit. They're a propaganda outfit. I go on Chris Wallace because I like him, and actually I think he is fair. He's tough, and of course he has to spout the party line once in a while, which he did yesterday. But I don't go on any of those other programs because it's not a serious outfit. So that's a propaganda statement. And it's interesting. I saw that earlier, and I thought to myself, that's really interesting. That's what you'd expect from a spokesman from a right-wing politician, and it's not a coincidence.
By the way, here are some of the people you might run into if you went on more Fox News programs. The failed candidate Sarah Palin, the failed candidate Mike Huckabee, the failed candidate Rudy Giuliani, and I can go on and on all night long.